While commercial aircraft have been equipped with some form of autopilot since all the way back in 1912, what's really interesting is just how far automation has now advanced. Embraer recently announced a new system which has really got people talking, and this brings up an interesting question. Has automation finally made us pilots redundant? Stay tuned. Pilots sometimes refer to their autopilot as George, and there's a bit of debate where that name originally came from. Some say it came from George the Bison, who patented something called the pilot assister back in the 1930s, whilst others claim that it actually goes back to the good old Air Force days. Now, the George that those early pilots were working with was pretty basic compared to what we have today. It was really just a gyroscopic heading and attitude indicator connected to hydraulically operated elevators and rudders. In other words, pretty simple stuff that could only really work under very specific conditions. But here is where it gets interesting. In our modern commercial aircraft, George now does a whole lot more than just control heading and attitude. The autopilot is now hugely integrated with almost all other aircraft systems, providing what we call full flight management functions. And as these systems become more and more capable and complex, we're also seeing some really big shifts in the relationship between the pilots and the aircraft. Now, this might cause people to ask, what's even the point of having pilots nowadays? But despite what you might think, we pilots actually do still play a crucial role. It's just changing slightly. So let me explain how automation and pilots actually do interact in today's modern aircraft and what this relationship really looks like. You see, up until we moved into what we now call Generation 3 and 4 aircraft, we pilots were generally much more physically involved with the actual flight controls. That meant that we really did all of the flying stuff, like handling the takeoffs and landings, monitoring and managing. And we did all of that through direct links between our controls and the aircraft control surfaces. So when we moved the control column, those surfaces also moved in the same way. Now I can almost hear some of you saying, but they still had autopilots back then, and you would be absolutely right. But here's the thing, those autopilots had very limited functions and protections, and to be honest, they weren't really that reliable either. They worked fine for cruise flight, allowing the pilots to relax a bit, but not much more than that. The protections built into those early aircraft were also pretty basic. Generally, they just included some simple overspeed, stall and a few other warnings, working from the aircraft air data probes and angle of attack indicators. And those couldn't do much more than make loud noises if things started to go wrong. Now, most aircraft did still have some protection features like stick shakers and sometimes even stick pushers who could activate if the aircraft was stalling, but these weren't connected to the automation and pilots could easily override them if they wanted. But modern fly-by-wire aircraft, well, that's a completely different story. Overall, they're just much safer, and there are a couple of really good reasons for that. You see, modern fly-by-wire system no longer has that direct link between the pilots and the control surfaces. Instead, everything that we do gets converted into electrical signals, and then those passes through the flight control computers before the commands reaches into the flight controls. And those computers, well, they can have all sorts of protections built into them if the manufacturer wants, which most of them obviously do. Now, there are differences in the level of protections between different manufacturers, and if you want to understand more about that, well then check out my video about Airbus versus Boeing, where we go into this in a lot more detail. But for now, what's really important to understand is that modern fly-by-wire systems allow for much more monitoring of safety parameters and protections than the older systems ever could. And this isn't just limited to basic flight controls. No, these flight management systems are now integrated with basically everything from traffic monitoring to terrain proximity systems, wind shear warnings and aircraft configuration checks. The range of warnings and protections we now have access to is really quite impressive, And on top of that, the automation now also often handles the actual controlling of the aircraft, meaning the thrust and speed, the movement of flight control surfaces to bank, pitch and yaw, as well as trajectory planning. The flight management computer, or FMC as we call it, has the full route programmed into it. It also contains things like winds, aircraft weight, fuel burn, performance statistics and a navigation database. And from all of this, it can work out the flight's optimum altitude, where to start descending, where to start decelerating, how much fuel we need in order to reach certain airports. And these same systems also monitors for faults and can often automatically switch to backup systems or at least give us checklists to help troubleshoot most problems that might arise. When was the last time that you thought about online security? Most people assume that they would notice if someone was trying to steal their information, that there would be signs, but cyber criminals have gotten way more sophisticated now. Today, even pages that looks legit could be fronts for harvesting your data, which could then leave you vulnerable to things like phishing scams, cyber attacks and even fraud. That's why today's sponsor, NordVPN, is so important. Nord is the only VPN on the market with official certification from independent cybersecurity testers. And in June of 2025 alone, their Threat Protection Pro blocked over 50 million phishing scams and 10 million malware attacks. And the best part is that these security features still work even when you're not connected to a VPN. So whether you are shopping online, checking news sites or browsing social media, with Nord you're always protected in the background. Right now, NordVPN are offering you, my viewers, 4 extra months free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. Just scan this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/mentor now to get started. Plus, remember that with Nord you always get a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you don't risk anything by trying. Thank you so much, Nord, for helping and supporting what we do. Now let's continue. Now, I know what you're thinking, that I'm not really improving the case for pilots here, but hold that thought, because I really am, and here's why. You see, while modern automation can do an incredible amount, it still has several big limitations. First of all, most of these systems can really only handle specific tasks, and if something breaks, another system can't just take over and redesign itself to handle those tasks as well. And this means that when things break, and they do, it's us pilots who have to sort it out. And that is super important to remember, especially when we start talking about even more innovations that are now coming. Because no matter what, there are still some things that humans just do better than the machines. And on top of that, it's actually we pilots who do most of the FMC programming, or at least check that the programming entered makes sense. And why is that, you might ask? Well, that's because what's in there is based on some very basic assumptions, like that the aircraft will fly a full arrival procedure, for example, which of course will have an impact on, for example, where the aircraft will want to start descending. But in reality, we almost never fly a full arrival route. Instead, during the arrival and approach, we pilots have to take multiple decisions in order to adapt to what air traffic control requests or offers us, like shortcuts, for example. If we would just set it up and let it go, the autopilot would do exactly what it's been told to do and nothing else. And that would mean not descending early in order to enable an anticipated shortcut, for example. The second limitation, and this is a really big one, is that the autopilot can't make decisions. So managing and monitoring the outside condition, environment and all of the things that might impact flight safety, that still very much needs a pilot's judgment. Sure, the aircraft can tell us you're running low on fuel and even show us what other airports might be available, but it's not going to check if the weather is okay, assess the involved risks or make complex decisions about which option is actually most suitable. Now this might be changing. Airbus has been working on something pretty interesting called Project Dragonfly, which I've also covered in one of my videos, and it uses biomimicry and computer learning in order to help aircraft organize their own diversions. The biomimicry part refers to multiple sensors they are using that allow the aircraft to spot hazards and plan around them. And I have to say that this is quite an advancement in aircraft design. But even with these sensors, how much this system will enable the aircraft to decide for itself isn't really clear. Give it a choice between two airports for a medical diversion, for example, and it will probably pick the closest one within weather limits. But what if an airport that's slightly further away allows for better performance, quicker turnaround times, has appropriate medical facilities nearby, or would let us continue our route after dropping off the sick passenger? These are typical factors that a trained and experienced pilot will mix into the decision making, something that requires dynamic thinking and not just acting on a set of predetermined parameters. Now, the discussion about whether a second pilot or even any pilot will still be needed when automation reaches these levels is a huge debate, and honestly that's not really what this video is supposed to be about. But I am very vocal in my support for a minimum of 2 pilots in the cockpit at any given time, and I think that I've highlighted several good reasons for that over on the Mentour Pilot channel. But anyway, let's now look at what Embraer has come up with and what this might mean for pilots, because at first glance it looks like it could have just taken away another task from us. You probably know that many aircraft already can auto-land today, and every time that I talk about that, someone always asks me why we don't let them do that every single time if they have that capability. And the thing that I think that a lot of people don't understand is that the Autoland system isn't actually designed to do the landing under normal conditions. Instead, it's really only there to support the pilots in challenging weather conditions, specifically when the visibility is poor. If we would decide to do an autoland, the aircraft will be pre-programmed to intercept the instrument landing system guidance and bring itself down towards the runway, whilst maintaining the correct vertical and lateral trajectory, the right speed, flare for the landing, and sometimes even brake automatically. The Airbus A380 and Airbus A350, they go even further because they can actually decelerate for a specific exit on the runway. But even though that's the case, there are still some really important parts that the pilots will have to do during this maneuver. First of all, configuring the aircraft is always done manually. This is partially because no approach is identical. Air traffic control might need different separation and therefore have to slow one aircraft down earlier, bring one in closer, or sometimes even require us to do a sidestep over to an adjacent runway. Obviously not during an autoland though. And on top of that, there are also failure considerations where we might need a different flap or slat setting than normal. The same applies on the ground when it comes to the reverse thrust selection, which is also done manually. But the biggest restriction? Well, that's the fact that the autopilot generally cannot handle the aircraft as well as a pilot can during landing. So what do I mean by that then? Well, autopilots have more restrictive limitations in terms of things like the approach gradient, meaning how steep an approach is, and also how strong the wind is allowed to be. The Boeing 787, for example, can only handle a headwind or a crosswind of 25 knots if it's going to do an autoland, but if you give the controls over to a pilot, we can land it in up to 40 knots crosswind and with no real headwind limitation at all. The autopilot also tends to flare earlier than a pilot will do, and this can result in a longer required landing distance, which also have to be taken into account. All this means that if you are about to operate the airplane into low visibility conditions, then yes, sometimes we are going to let the aircraft land, but not because we pilots can't do it. Instead, it's just much safer for us to have the aircraft fly while we monitor everything else and look outside to try to find visual references. But if you ask the system to land in gusty, bumpy or turbulent conditions, well then no. As far as I know, no aircraft can currently land automatically in stronger winds than a trained pilot can. But what about takeoff then? Well, that's what I really wanted to get to here, because up until very recently, no aircraft was able to take off automatically. But over the last couple of years, Airbus and now also Embraer have both been trialing automatic takeoffs, and this raises an interesting question. Why? What benefit is there in having an aircraft take off instead of the pilot doing so? How is this supporting our role rather than just relegating us further into a management position? Well, let's look at some safety statistics here, and I'll be using the EASA annual safety review of 2024 for this. If we look at that, we can see that the number of events occurring in different phases of flight, particularly during approach and landing, are at the very top, along with en route. Takeoff is the next highest in terms of incident frequency. So takeoff is definitely a problem phase where the risk of things going wrong or not going quite right seems to be a bit higher. Common issues tend to be directly related to the rotation, where over-rotation, that's when the pilot is rotating too quickly, increases the risk of tail strike, and under-rotation, where the pilot rotates too slowly, reduces the obstacle clearance margins, which I clearly showed in a recent Mentour pilot video. And if the pilot should, for whatever reason, choose to rotate at the wrong speeds, this can also lead to all sorts of similar problems. So executing the takeoff correctly is crucial for the safe and efficient operation of the aircraft. Now, as we've already seen, the big benefit of automating things is that it frees up the pilot's capacity to manage complex situations and maintain a better big picture awareness. In other words, if we're having to focus too much on flying the aircraft manually, well, then there's a good chance that we might miss something. So knowing that, the takeoff phase could definitely benefit from a system that increases pilot capacity and awareness, especially since, relatively speaking, so many incidents clearly happen during that phase. There's no question that automatic takeoffs would help protect against things like tail strike, for example, because incorrect rotation due to pilot error or due to changing outside conditions is one of the most common causes for these type of incidents. And that's despite some aircraft already having some quite advanced systems for monitoring and protecting against tail strikes. To give an example of such a system, let's go back to our fly-by-wire protections and look specifically at an aircraft like the Airbus A340. The A340-600 was for a long time the longest aircraft flying commercially, 2.26 meters longer than even the mighty Airbus A380. And this long fuselage meant that it was also at a high risk of tail strikes. So Airbus has built in some protections to help mitigate this threat. If the pilot rotates too fast, well, then the system automatically senses that and physically limits the pitch rate. But there is a catch here. This only works if the pilot has pulled back once on the side stick. If the pilot would pull back a little bit more, well, then the protection is lost. Now you might ask, why would a pilot do that? And that might be because they feel that the aircraft was rotating a little bit too slow or not enough, for example. You see, the Airbus A340, because of its length, and this is true for most super large aircraft, can take quite a while to really unstick from the runway during takeoff. The Airbus A340 is particularly susceptible to this sensation because of its length and the position of the cockpit in relation to the undercarriage, and this leads to a higher tendency for pilots to re-rotate and therefore still risk tail striking it. So while there is a protection there, it can't stop the pilot from intervening and still making errors, and that's why an automatic takeoff system could be beneficial. But it doesn't stop there. You see, sudden changes in wind during rotation can change the speed and therefore requiring us pilots to adjust the pitch attitude quickly in order to achieve the desired flight path and rotation rate. This is absolutely critical because of the small speed margins and obstacle clearance requirements, and it's in situations like that that the automatic systems really shine, since it can compute things incredibly fast, much faster than our human brains can. And that means that it also can respond to changing conditions almost instantly and very accurately. When Embraer presented the automatic takeoff system, they pointed out something quite interesting. If you do 1,000 automatic takeoffs, you'll also get 1,000 identical takeoffs. And that's because of the system's ability to sense, assess, and react to changes at speeds far beyond what we humans are ever able to do. And it turns out that there are even more benefits with this, because Embraer's E2 Enhanced Takeoff System, or E2TS, can also actually increase the aircraft range or payload. And how? Well, it really optimizes the takeoff performance, since it doesn't have to rely on human reaction times. This means that it can rotate slightly earlier and do so at a steeper angle, or rather one with smaller margins to the tail strike angle, since when we pilots rotate, we do so with some extra margins built in to account for our small errors. This optimization can increase the maximum takeoff weight, which means more passengers or more fuel, meaning a longer potential range. Embraer also estimates an average fuel burn reduction of around 2.5% associated with the auto takeoff, along with some other improvements in their engine bleed efficiency and ability to make minor aerodynamic adjustments. So, how does this system actually work then? Well, with automatic takeoff mode selected, the pilots will then essentially do a normal takeoff, setting the takeoff thrust and then controlling the aircraft using the rudder down the center line. If something would happen during the takeoff roll, well then the pilots will reject the takeoff, just as they have always done. But if everything goes well, then the big change will come when the aircraft reaches the rotation speed, VR, where the E2TS system will take over and rotate automatically. It will do so with the help of 4 smart probes and its 3 internal flight control computers, and then it will climb at a slightly steeper angle. Now, the E2TS is what we call a fail-passive system, meaning that if something in the system fails, well then the aircraft will revert to manual control. In other words, give it back to us pilots. So the pilot flying will have to keep their hand on the yoke, just like always, in case they have to take over. The passive part in the fail-passive refers to the fact that if it disengages, it also ensures that there's no significant deviation from the required flight path, meaning it gives the aircraft over to the pilots fully in trim and requiring no initial input unless conditions outside change. And this, by the way, is the same way that the system works when we're doing Autolands as well. Now, the system can apparently also handle engine failures and cope with a certain level of crosswind, but of course, in the event of failures and degradations to the system, we pilots are still needed, which is exactly why Embraer is not promoting this as the next step towards single pilot operations. Instead, this is a system designed as a tool to support the pilots by making operations safer. So in summary, what this all means is that while aircraft can land and soon take off by themselves, the autopilot, or George, remains just a tool for increasing pilot capacity and awareness, not something designed to remove pilots from the flight deck. And that's really what this is all about. Making aviation even safer, while keeping us pilots where we belong, in the flight deck, doing what we do best. Managing, monitoring, and making sure that those critical decisions that automations just can't handle are still being taken. But at least they can't handle it yet. Now, if you want to learn how to actually operate the autopilot during an autoland, or how we pilots really work with the Boeing 737, well then you have to check out Ben's and my virtual Boeing 737 type course. If you use this QR code or go to virtual737course.com, you will get over 10 hours of easy to understand instruction from 2 experienced type rating examiners. And if you use the code Mentour now, that will give you an awesome 20% off the normal price. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!